Hello, BookTube. So recently I made a video about a week ago about my read speeding or my speed reading challenge and reading comprehension challenge, and I'd like to make a uh, recap video of that first week. First week, I showed 4 books that I wanted to read that for that week, and I wanted to, and so now I finished them. I finished the 4th book today, and I'd like to do just a bit of a recap about that first week. Um, just some notes beforehand. If you don't really know what that uh, challenge is about, it's about me reading really fast or just fast enough to push my comprehension or to force myself to uh, read at a faster speed. So I'm looking at all the words and I'm seeing all the words, but my brain is struggling to process them, and I'm doing it just at the certain amount of speed so that I can still know what I'm reading while I look at the words. And I'm looking at all the words, so I am reading, but just my brain is struggling to keep up and struggling to process all the words. So that's what that is about. And As I expected, it was a challenge in the beginning because, it's like everything else when you are developing a new habit and trying to strengthen a muscle. It's not easy and it's painful and it's difficult to begin with, but once you start seeing payoffs, then it um, becomes really worth it, I think. And that's what I found out this past week. It really it started off as a struggle, but as the week came along and I started reading different books, and I could I really noticed that my reading comprehension was starting to catch up. It became a lot more fun as the week went along, and so I want this video to be kind of a recap of that first week, the 4 books that I read. I'd just like to go over them and say a few words on them, and also give my TBR for this upcoming week. I have another 4 books that I want to read this week, um, and I'll show those to you after I discuss what I read this previous week. So the first book that I started off with is this book. Sorry for the bad lighting. Um, it's The End of the European Era, uh, from 1890 to the present, by Felix Gilbert and David Clay Large. This is a textbook that I had to read for school or for a university class, and that class only went up to the Second World War, so I only read about half of the book, and I wanted to come back to this, and I felt like this book would be the perfect book to start off that Western canon, or no, not Western canon. Start off my reading challenge, and I was right. This was a perfect read to start off with. Um, this is written as a textbook, so it's really doesn't really zoom in much into historical subjects. It just gives you a broad overview of European era during this time. From I started right around the Second World War, and then I just went all the way, and it goes all the way up to about the present. And I found it interesting because it goes over a lot of politics and stuff that I just don't know about. It's a era of history that the most relevant or most recent era of history that I really don't know a lot about. So a lot of the names were new to me, or some of them I've heard of them, but I just didn't know their significance, and that was really interesting to read. And with my fast reading, this book was a bit of a challenge at times because it got boring. I found uh, I lost interest because because I got the gist of what I was reading, but I couldn't. One of the challenges was that I was not allowed to go back and read paragraphs or pages that I didn't really fully comprehend, and that was part of the ruthlessness of the challenge. And so that's what uh, the experience of reading this was like. Um, but overall, I found it was a good book to start off with because I had read part of this before. I knew what I was getting into, And it was interesting. The subject was interesting enough for me to keep going, to want to read this, but it was not, um, uh, wasn't captivating enough for me to feel like I missed a whole lot from through my fast reading. The next book I read was a novel. This is The Green Hills of Africa by Ernest Hemingway. This is my second Hemingway book. I hesitate to call this a novel because it's narrated by Hemingway. He's the title first person character, so we're getting his own thoughts. But yet it's written as if it were a novel. And the basic premise is that Hemingway and his wife and a number of friends went to Africa to do some hunting. And he documents uh, part of their trip in a novel form in this book. It's just under 300 pages. Uh, for my speed reading, this took me just a day to get through, which was a huge boost in my confidence in that this was working, that this challenge was working. Even though this is a relatively short book, just under 300 pages, and it's a smaller size. If you see here, you see it's really much smaller than a normal book size. So it's a mass market size, and the font is pretty big. But even then, I went through this really quickly, and I was glad to do so because I can't imagine having to slog through this at my previously slow reading pace, because it wasn't terribly interesting. I did not find it um, very engaging, and I think it's Hemingway in general. One of his quirks I just really do not like, and that not just his obvious sexism, but even um, just his style, where he thinks he writes as if everything that he's talking about, or everything that all the events that he's describing have such huge significance to them when they really don't. Because this is about him glorifying and shooting animals, and he really does glorify in it. He and he obsesses about it, and he's got a friend named Carl that he's in competition with, and they're both obsessing over shooting certain animals and getting the best one and the biggest one, and which one has the largest horns. And that wasn't pleasant to read to begin with, but he thinks that he takes this trip, the story of this trip, and he obviously is wanting the reader to see it as some overarching meaning, capital M, profound meaning in this story. You know, the struggles that he goes through uh, with his hunting is, the struggles that we all face when we go through certain difficulties, and that kind of dragged out crap like that. For example, one of the um, parts in this book, let's see if I can find it. I can't find it offhand. But one of them is called, uh, he divides it into different parts, different sections, and one of them, if I can find it, part 4, I think it was, is called The Pursuit of Happiness. When this book, there's not much happy in this book at all. And it's just Hemingway himself obsessing over slaughtering animal other animal forms and taking pleasure in it. But I yeah, I do not like this book at all, and I'm glad that I only spent a day on it because I don't see myself ever going back to it. The next book is another non-fiction book. It's a nice hardcover. It's The Cure for Catastrophe: How We Can Stop Manufacturing Natural Disasters by Robert Moore Wood. I don't know how to pronounce that middle name there, or that before the hyphen. So Moore, that's the best I can do. Anyway, like most people, I assumed this book had to do with climate change, and he does talk about climate change a bit, but he doesn't. But it's not nearly the main focus of this book. The main focus of this book is on human interaction, or how humans live and interact with yeah, violent weather forms. And the main violent weather forms that he goes over are hurricanes, volcano eruptions, floods and tsunamis, and earthquakes. And mostly the focus has to do on how these impact cities, because cities have huge concentrations of people with many buildings all in one place, and and they usually, when a tornado, or not a tornado, he doesn't talk about tornadoes very much in this book, which is kind of surprising. But when a hurricane or an earthquake strikes a city, it leaves a devastating um, after effect, because buildings topple down, and uh, things are blown away, trees are pulled out, and uh, whatever floods happen, and people who live on lower floors, or live in areas where the water likes to pool into, really are affected the most. But anyways, this book, uh, he really does focus on the building aspect, about how like with brick buildings usually uh, in the early days really topple down like a house of cards during earthquakes, and or how and how that impacts the death toll. And what I didn't like about this book is that the subtitle makes it look like he's creating an argument, but really this book is just he gives each chapter a certain theme, and like whether it's the history of how people reacted to natural disasters, whether that's through superstition, um, or like in the early days when people thought hurricanes were or different natural disasters were judgment from God, and then other chapters where he looks at how people build buildings in cities, and then how they change, or they try to change their building style after a natural disaster tears them all down, and has kills a lot of people. And what I didn't like about this book is that in each chapter he just uh, throws a ton of stories at you, and they're not even fleshed out stories about real people. He not most of the cases they aren't. Some cases they are, and those are interesting. Like he opens up with that in the first chapter, but most of the time it's this city here had was situated in this place, and then there was an earthquake, lots of buildings fell down, thousands of people died, and then when they tried to rebuild it, the city had these different building guidelines, and the guidelines weren't followed, or there was a 200-year period, and then there's another earthquake, and by that time people had forgotten about the previous earthquake, because 200 years is a long time, and then lots of buildings collapse again. And but one of the and he just throws story like that out, story after story of that, and you get like 1,000 people die here, 10,000 people die here, and it gets um, you get really callous over the loss of death, or the loss of life in this book, or that all the disasters that have to do with real people and real situations, and so he tries to make it a storybook, he's trying to tell a story while presenting an argument, and he fails at both. That's what I felt like, and I also felt like after the few chapters when he was doing this, I found it interesting, but then it just got really repetitive and boring after a while, and so I don't see myself ever really rereading this, going back to it anytime soon. Uh, and so with my speed reading, I felt like I'm glad that I could read this a lot faster at a pace than what I normally read, which was the point of why I was choosing books like this, books that I wasn't sure I would enjoy as much, because I knew I did not want to dwell on them for too long, longer than I had to if they weren't as entertaining as I hoped. Or, anyways, and then the last book, the book that I did finish today, is The White Tiger. It's a novel by Aravind Adiga. This won the Booker Prize in 2008. I don't usually read contemporary novels, but this book was I picked this up at a thrift store, and I didn't. It. I think someone had recommended this book, and I don't remember who it was. I think it was certainly someone on BookTube, but I don't remember who it was. Um, but this book was a big surprise to me. I really ended up enjoying this book, And the reason why I enjoy this book is because it was it was a lot more serious and a lot more deeper and morally ambiguous than I thought it would be. Because when I sampled this book when I first got it, I read just the first few pages, and already I disliked the narrative style, where it was a first person um, narrator interacting with writing this book as if he were giving his personal history to a prominent person he's trying to impress. And I thought it was going to be cheesy and wacky for wacky's sake, if that's a term. Um, and but it, and in some sense that was the case, but it was not nearly as heavy-handed as I thought it would be, and it really was dark and really interesting. Uh, and it was at many times it was also quite funny, which is one of the narrative style really set it up for that. So this is the story of Balram Halai he and how he grows up in a poor neighborhood in a poor town in India, and he uh, becomes a servant for a rich family, and uh, and then jumps up from a servant in a rich family to an entrepreneur who's making his own decisions and making money in a city in India. And he uses this climb from the very poor parts of India to a servant in a city to him being an entrepreneur in a city as a cultural commentary on India itself and the corruption of the Indian culture. And I found, even if you don't know anything about Indian culture, which I don't, I found it really interesting and really thought provoking and quite scathing, really. It is a scathing book on the aspects of this aspect of Indian culture about how so many Indians imbibe this concept of servitude, where they are meant to serve the rich people, the very small percent of rich people, and but how the Indians don't even want to get out of this perpetual servitude. But then but it's also ambiguous because there's a character in here called the big socialist or the grand socialist, or the good socialist. So I forget which epithet it was, but it was one of those, and uh, a counter. He's supposed to be a counter to the rich people, uh, in the rich people and the politicians that run the show, and yet he's also portrayed as being really no different than they are, even though he's inciting the population as if he's on their side because he calls himself a socialist, right? But yeah, this book is really well done, and it was a quick read as well. It's under 300 pages, and I found myself slowing down just to uh, read and capture and enjoy this novel because it was so much better than I thought it would be, and I was really glad for that. Uh, it really did exceed my admittedly low expectations. I'm not usually one to read contemporary novels like this, but I was glad I did in this case. This was a good book. Anyways, this video has really gotten long, and I think I'll do uh, another video uh, that will introduce my TBR for the upcoming week instead. Anyways, I'll leave that there. Thanks, BookTube.